Silent Hill 2 is the kind of game where you think about it every day for years. Moving away from the occult origins of its predecessor and diving disturbingly deep into psychological horror, it is often held up as the definitive example of video games as art. Fans and critics fawn over its choice sound design, its creepy symbolic monsters, and the astounding consideration and tact of the horror presented. It has stood the test of time because it twisted the genre of survival horror and created an experience that no one can easily forget. Nathan Fielder is a Canadian comedian who delves so far into post-irony that it becomes uncanny. His work tugs at the heartstrings as much as it shocks. Nathan, over the course of 2 shows and 1 documentary, has made a name for himself as someone who pushes the limits of comedy into a hazy grey area of humour, emotion, and the darkness of the human psyche. At first glance, these 2 properties are wildly different, and make no mistake, they are. But both of them share a knack for articulating human truths and deeply upsetting an audience. After a recent playthrough of Silent Hill 3, I made a couple of connections that, when I looked it up online, I found no discussion about. So, I decided to do all of the discourse myself. To me, one property represents the beginning of grief, and the other reveals the misery of Lamentations. I believe there are likely a lot of crossover fans, because they both look unflinchingly into the void of consciousness and love, and then they come away with surprisingly similar answers. Without further ado, this piece will feature frank discussions of sexual assault, suicidality, and it will feature upsetting depictions of mental illness. Necessarily, it will be quite depressing. If you are interested in watching this video but you are sensitive about any of these topics, I will provide timecodes to skip over the most distressing parts. I don't want to spoil the experience of either of these properties, as they are 2 of the most emotionally moving pieces of art that I've ever seen in my entire life. So if that means I lose your viewership, then that is worth it to me. Chuck this video on your watch later and come back in 6 months. Chapter 1. Sublimation. I'm not interested in rehashing interpretations that are decades old. Yes, the monsters of Silent Hill represent James's sexual frustration, and of course, Nathan Fielder is a strange man and it's difficult to tell what he believes. I'm not going to pretend that you don't know any of that so that I can feel a tinge cleverer than I am. Rather, I want to take a deep dive into both of these properties so that we can investigate the nature of grief. David Lynch's 1986 film Blue Velvet is fantastic. It follows a young man named Jeffrey as he uncovers the seedy underbelly of his nice, homogenized childhood town. It's a tender film that can be hard to watch due to its frank sexuality and visceral violence. It feels like a waking nightmare in the best possible way. It forces you into a dreamlike trance, one in which you can't look away. There are 2 critical scenes from the film that will be relevant to our discussion. The first scene is particularly infamous. Dorothy, played by Isabella Rossellini, appears before the main character as he is being confronted by some bullies. She walks into the scene naked and bruised. Everyone is immediately horrified, and the squabbles over the main character's girlfriend stops as they get Dorothy to safety. Because of scenes like this, the film was legendarily torn to shreds by critic Roger Ebert.
Blue Velvet is a movie that really challenges you to think about your reactions to it. And my reaction is, I think this movie is cruelly unfair to its actors. But he asks Isabella Rossellini in this movie to be undressed and humiliated on the screen, as few actresses ever have been, certainly in non-porno roles. And then he tries to take the edge off her shocking scenes by turning the whole thing into some kind of a joke. Well, either this material is funny, in which case you don't take advantage of your stars, or it isn't funny, in which case it shouldn't have so much campy and adolescent dialogue along with the really powerful sexual scenes.
Do you mind? To which Rossellini defended Lynch and proclaimed that she was happy to perform. She was under no pressure and consent was at the forefront of their artistic endeavours. This is a sentiment that has been consistent throughout all of Lynch's work, but what is most interesting about this scene to me is how it is somewhat autobiographical. When Lynch was a little boy, he was playing in the street, and he became frightened when a naked and bruised woman appeared before him, disoriented and hurt.
I don't know what we were doing, but from across Shoshone Avenue, out of the darkness, comes this, kind of like a strangest dream. And she was completely naked. And I think her mouth was bloodied. And she came closer and closer, and my brother started to cry. Something was bad wrong with her. And I don't know what happened, but I think she sat down on a curb crying. But it was very mysterious, like we were seeing something otherworldly. And I wanted to do something for her, but I was little. I didn't know what to do.
To me, what makes Blue Velvet so powerful is that it seems to be Lynch creating a kind of backstory for this poor woman from his childhood. He wants to give dignity to her in whatever way he can, by empathizing with a hurt woman and synthesizing what led to that fateful moment. In doing all of this, he sought to give her agency. I spent the opening section of this chapter speaking about that special scene from Blue Velvet, not just because the works of David Lynch are well known to have been an influence on the Silent Hill series, alongside Jacob's Ladder, which I made a video about last year, and the artwork of Francis Bacon. All of these are important, but I wish to communicate that monsters are not what scare us the most. People are. Silent Hill 2 is scariest to me when it reflects the emotions that I have felt, and it makes me reassess vengeful feelings, malignant lamentations, and self-destruction that I have experienced and have since tried to bury. Nathan Fielder is also a man who scares me, primarily because he's a living supervillain.
My name is Nathan Fielder, and I graduated from one of Canada's top business schools with really good grades.
For the Fog fans, his show, Nathan For You, is kind of like Kitchen Nightmares by way of Eric Andre. Nathan tours struggling businesses across America and attempts to help them make money. But the format of each episode frames this so-called help as a kind of impractical joke. Like, let's look at Season 2, Episode 2, where Nathan meets the owner of a struggling Hollywood gift store. This owner can't make money because he's 6 blocks away from the competition. So Nathan's plan is to fake the making of a movie, complete with a fake Johnny Depp impersonator and also a Bill Gates impersonator.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. You know, when we started our computers, back in the 80s, it was huge.
In order to trick customers into thinking that they are actually part of the movie, just to get their money. In order to get around the laws of fraud, Nathan starts a film festival to claim that the film in question will win an award, as an excuse to not pay back the customers. It is delightfully insane the impractical lengths that he will go to, rather than just give any kind of solid business advice. In real life, Nathan reportedly compensated everyone who bought something, but in the show's fiction, it shows how desperate the small businesses are that they would allow something so insane to happen in the first place. Let's also look at Season 3, Episode 6, where Nathan wants to help a struggling hotel. He decides that the reasonable thing to do is to appeal to the frustrated feelings of the parents. Family trips might leave parents sexually frustrated, so he decides to build a soundproof box for the children to sit in while the parents have sex, and then he tests this out with a 10-person orgy.
Blast off!
This idea is simultaneously a prank on the parents of the test child, showing the extreme show parents will go to make their child famous.
I like it, Jurgen.
I gave them your names to make it more realistic.
And it's a prank on the hotel itself to show how they will try anything to make a few extra dollars. He moves beyond irony itself to pull this off. I love the concept of post-irony. I'm obsessed with it, and I will try my best to visualize it here. We have an unironic sincerity, where you just appreciate the thing. And then you have irony, in which you like something because it's bad, and that in and of itself is humorous to you. And then you have this thing called post-irony, which is irony about irony, and you like the thing so much that you look exactly the same as a sincere fan. Alternatively, take this comment about gay marriage. Happy Pride Month. It's not just that irony is used here to deflect criticism, it blows the line so brilliantly that you can't tell what someone actually thinks. Likewise, Nathan's pursuits are often so lost in ironic sincerity that you can't tell whether or not he actually wants to help his clients. If Eric Andre wants to prank his guests to ridicule the format of late night talk shows, then Nathan wants to get to know the guests precisely because they are so boring. Because if he can learn how to be vapid and boring, then he can potentially escape being an asocial creep. There are often claims made in Silent Hill 2 that the voice acting is bad, and ironically, this makes the game creepier.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
The line often goes, no one in their right mind would behave like this, so it's unintentionally unnerving. But I have a hard time calling them explicitly bad because bad voice acting is often due to a lack of direction. I can't say that about Silent Hill 2 because there is one member of the voice cast that is genuinely phenomenal. Monica Horgan plays Mary and her doppelganger Maria, and her performance is so genuinely unnerving and sad that it makes the game. Not to say that the rest of the game isn't great, but she is the linchpin, the eye of the duck. David Lynch has this theory of aesthetics, in which he argues that what makes the duck such a wonderful creature to draw is that its eye is almost sublimely placed in the perfect spot on its head.
It always is interesting that the eye is in the perfect place. If you move it to the body, it would get lost. If you move it to the leg or the beak, it's two kind of fast areas competing. Even though the eye is the fastest, it's the little jewel.
He argues that every piece of art has one element that ties everything together.
I believe every film has the eye of the duck scene.
The second important scene from Blue Velvet is the performance of the candy-colored Sandman.
I close my eyes.
Lynch refers to it as the eye of the duck for Blue Velvet. It's the moment where you realize that the villain can't tell the difference between reality and fiction, that he is so far beyond the realm of empathy and kindness. Very similarly, Maria is the eye for Blue Velvet. Her performances are the emotional backbone of the entire story. I believe that the voice acting is thus extremely calculated. It is certainly off-kilter, but the performance of Maria is not an accident. It is brilliant, and the same team that wrote her wrote every single other character. Silent Hill 2 doesn't have ironically bad voice acting. Rather, it is sincere in how unnerving these characters act, and that adds to the themes of mental ill health. Like with Lynch playing tribute to the memory of the bruised lady from his youth, the creatives aim to give these mentally disturbed characters an amount of dignity, and that is why the game comes across as so sensitive rather than vulgar. Chapter 2, Castration. Silent Hill 2, for the small business fans in the audience, is the story of James Sunderland, a widower who mysteriously receives a letter from his long-dead wife, which directs him to the abandoned town of Silent Hill. On this adventure, James fights terrible monsters with a stick. He has disorienting conversations with lost souls.
Don't worry, I'm not crazy.
And he meets his dead wife's doppelganger.
Are you confusing me with someone else?
The game is a dreary experience, in which James walks through a hell of his own creation, asunder from his own sanity, and hopefully he comes out the other side with a healthier outlook on things. Although most of the endings do not facilitate this for him. It's a game that goes there, staring deep into the abyss of suicidality, and in daring to blink, it candidly explores the depths of grief and depression, all with a surprising tact and empathy for a computer game from 2001. For as corrosive as the setting is, misty and rusty, Silent Hill 2 feels immensely human. It articulates strange sensations that you might have felt in your belly but were a bit too embarrassed to mention out loud. And I have many critiques of the game, especially the boss fights, but the story has deeply affected me. I have thought about this game every single week ever since I played it for the first time a couple of years ago. In fact, it was the last game I played with an ex-partner, and shortly after that we did not part on good terms. I don't want to make this video about that experience, as you don't care and I don't wish to linger on it. But I feel it necessary to mention that I got the in-water ending, and fans of the game will already know that's a big oof. We will return to that towards the end of this chapter. What makes Silent Hill 2 so special to so many people is that it's a game that respects your intelligence. The premise: a man receives a letter from his long-dead wife and decides to go to a scary town to find her when she is, again, dead is patently absurd. So the developers decide to seriously interrogate what would bring a person to behave like this. James's wife Mary was sick with a terminal illness for the last few years of her life, so the monsters in the town become psychosexual manifestations of James's own repressed sexuality and guilt. And all of this is Baby's first Silent Hill analysis. It is perhaps the only game where the overt sexualization actually serves a narrative purpose, because it goes much deeper than the buff triangle man with the big phallic sword, the Great Castrator. I mean, yes, that is also the intended implication, but there's some nuance to it. There are several scenes in the game in which Pyramid Head grinds himself against lake monsters, and if it's not too crass to say out loud, this represents James's violent desires, the ways in which he had to restrain his sexual urges while his wife was sick. When James sees this and is afraid, it shows how James is afraid of these guilty desires, and how he has repressed it rather than confronting the misogynistic implications of all these guilty feelings. Further, it shows his sadomasochism, his willingness to put himself in harm's way to chase said desires. It becomes further upsetting when we consider that, actual final warning for spoilers, there is no turning back from here, and your entire experience will be changed. 3, 2, 1. James smothered Mary to death. And some of the in-game footage we see of this euthanasia is of her legs writhing and kicking about. That is speculative, to be sure, but the genius of Silent Hill 2 is that it is simultaneously blunt and abstract. Figures like Pyramid Head have a physical role to play, that being the DILF that the girls, the gays, and the theys want. But their actions are open to interpretation. Let's examine the eye of the duck herself, Maria, Mary's doppelganger. She is a psychological representation of James's guilt, manifested in the ways in which he conducted himself while Mary was mortally ill. James carried this burden with him, and he was driven mad with grief. He wasn't able to save her, so Maria taunts James over his lack of masculinity. She has a butterfly tattoo on her belly. Butterflies generally represent rebirth and new beginnings in media. Butterflies are all throughout the Silent Hill series. Heather Mason's sort of glorious complicated childhood bedroom is full of them, and you fight one in the first game. Silent Hill 2 is less concerned with the cult that is the focus of the former and the latter, and it refocuses on the internal lamentations of its characters. Before we meet Maria, James walks into a room with a hole in the wall that is surrounded by butterflies. Reaching into the hole is creepy as a player, there is no explicit jump scare in this sequence. And of course there is sexual imagery. James has to enter his hand into a yonic hole to progress. But if you keep your torch on, the butterflies will follow you across the room, like moths following electrified lamps. These butterflies phase through James's arm as he enters the hole, so this foreshadows that Mary is a manifestation, she's not real. Mary is rather an idealized and sexualized figure.
I can't believe it. You could be her twin. Your face, your voice, just your hair and clothes are different.
My name is Maria.
In being confronted with Maria's overt sexuality, it frustrates James more than it comforts. He didn't expect these lamentations to be satisfied, so he grows angry. We cannot recognize ourselves without others, and hell is other people, as Sartre famously asserted. So we meet some other lost souls, wandering the mist. We have the tragic teenager Angela Orozco, who is heavily implied to be the victim of repeated sexual assault. She runs around Silent Hill in search of her mother, while she sees flames engulfing the town while we see fog. She gives James the knife that she intends to kill herself with, and this becomes a mirror for his own suicidal and delusional quest to find his dead wife alive. We also have Eddie Dombrowski, an overweight teenager who is the most overtly psychotic character, simultaneously bragging about killing dogs and actively denying it. In place of fire or fog, Eddie remarks about the townsfolk laughing at him, a symptom of his long-term bullying. Both of these characters represent something in James that he doesn't like all that much. Angela represents James's depression and hopelessness, while Eddie represents his irrational anger and victimhood complex. Everyone sees something in Silent Hill, and that's what makes the setting so flexible and interesting for interpretation. It's important to note that, like, in the first game, the fog that we associate with Silent Hill was just a technical limitation. It was a way to render less stuff on the PS1. And in 2, it's exactly the same, but it now has a new artistic meaning to it. One of the things that makes the game as unique as it is was the parameters for its ending. Unlike most games where you need to acquire X item to change the ending from its predestined one, Silent Hill 2 psychoanalyzes the player purely by the way in which they play it. If James doesn't heal himself very often, he gets the in-water ending, where he drowns himself. This happens because, in-universe, James isn't looking after his own health. You also need to check Angela's knife, and engaging with this item represents James's own suicidal feelings. Looking at the suicidal woman's knives indicates that James is thinking as she does. Or in the Maria ending, you need to spend as much time possible with her namesake, and shield her from any incoming damage. You care so desperately for her that it defies all reason, and James thus denies the finality of Mary's death. This manifests in James and Maria walking out of Silent Hill together, while she lets out a soft cough. The ending of the game analyzes how you play it, and assigns to said playstyle the ways in which James feels. In the midst of my own grief, I was fascinated by this system, and I wonder why I got my particular ending. I don't want to say that at one point in my life I was particularly suicidal, because not really, but I considered Angela's knife, which I routinely checked throughout my first playthrough, because I thought it might be the solution to some puzzle. I then go back and I think about my life from that first playthrough, my own denial of agency, and I wonder why I got the in-water ending rather than the Maria one, which I feel would have been more situationally fitting for my headspace at the time, you know, holding on to something or someone for so long that they grow to despise you. It's like a self-harm. So what's the difference between these two bad endings? Brian de Lint of Utrecht University wrote the paper Narrative Death in Silent Hill 2. De Lint argues that video games can use death in more involving ways than a film or a book can. This is because video games demand agency from the player. You have to move your little guy around, you have to actively press the button to hit something with the stick. Thus, you feel kinetically connected to your character. This feeling has the potential to enhance the emotion of grief in a video game because the developer can deny the player their ability to play the game in such a way that they previously had. Consider... Look, it's not a spoiler, everyone knows about it. Final Fantasy's famous death of Aerith. De Lint argues that what was so effective about this death is that not only do we feel a narrative and emotional connection to her, but because she was a playable character, the player is no longer able to use her in combat. We can't use her spells or use her to heal us, or whatever she does. I'm not lame enough to play Final Fantasy. We lost her, so we feel as the characters do.
Death can be meaningful, perhaps even more so in the context of video games than in other forms of media because of the player's direct interaction with the game world. But in order for death to become more meaningful in game environments, its importance needs to be shifted from a state of losing to a state of loss.
We grieve as the characters do, because we have both lost emotional and kinetic access to the party member. Now, you might object that in Silent Hill 2, we don't have a party. We don't play as any other character than James, aside from the DLC, but that isn't in the core game. So, how can we grieve for Mary if we don't have access to her? According to De Lint, the answer to that is that we play as James, and we spend the entire time grieving after her. If the town of Silent Hill is a liminal space in which monsters and the characters represent James's anxieties and failures, then the agency of James becomes our own agency. Fail to heal him means that we don't care about his well-being. Because we see Maria's performance as compelling, we are incentivized by the game to look out for her. So, when she is killed by Pyramid Head later in the game, we may not grieve ourselves, but we see that James feels grief, and we thus feel bad for him.
The various different endings of the game represent different facets of the complicated grieving process, and these endings are directly related to actions that the player takes within the game. In some ways, the player is then responsible for helping the protagonist deal with the grief that he feels in relation to the death of his wife, and the manner in which the player helps him can ultimately decide the conclusion of his grieving process.
According to De Lint, the Maria ending represents the first stages of grief, denial, and anger. The game ends with James learning nothing and diving headfirst into fantasy, and he is narratively punished with the implication of Maria coughing like Mary once did. To further get this ending, you must leave the hallway monologue as soon as possible.
Well, what are you looking at? Get the hell out of here! Leave me alone already!
So that you don't hear Mary's apologetics for yelling at James.
Tell me I'll be okay. Tell me I'm not going to die.
We reinforce the blind lust for Maria and the denial of Mary's personhood. We idealize and forget what made Mary human in the first place. In water can then be seen as bargaining and depression. James flirts with Maria. He ums and ahs about how he feels about this sexy manifestation, and in his inability to decide what he actually wants, he abdicates responsibility for his actions, and this abdication takes the form of suicide. Instead of confronting his trauma and compartmentalizing his guilt for Mary's death, he drives his car into a lake. As I psychoanalyze myself, I do feel that while the ending of the game was appropriate for me, living in a similar situation of bargaining and denial myself, I honestly feel that the ending was closer to an accident. I checked the knife because I thought it was a quest item, supposed to be used to get an item out of a wall or something. I didn't heal myself because I was trying to conserve my healing items, as you usually do in horror games, and I read the relevant pieces of text because I was interested in the story. Nonetheless, I was privately bargaining and I got the end that reflected that. To me, Silent Hill 2 represents bargaining, living inauthentically and holding on to something for dear life even though it patently wants to end. Through the endings, we explore different aspects of grief and suffering in all of its glory. What is fantastic about these endings are the implications that we have as the player. James reflects our values back at us, whether or not we like or agree with them. It articulated that idolizing something and forgetting humanity is a worse fate than any other. Chapter 3, Lamentation. In the work of Nathan Fielder, there are recurring personalities. There's the security guard who likes big boobs.
Big boobs wasn't on the list.
There's the judge that Nathan routinely sought legal advice from.
It's fraud, theft, basically.
There's the private investigator who hates him.
You know what you are? You remind me of the Wizard of Loneliness. Look at you in a pink shirt and everything else. Oh, you're killing me.
And there's old Bill Heath, the professional Bill Gates impersonator.
You do this for a living, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Anytime they need an actor to play a businessman, they bring Bill back, and his bizarre mannerisms and strange intonations always steal the show.
I've worked so hard to get this computer project going.
He seems like a cartoon character, one of many that Nathan just encounters and then twists into some kind of prank he's pulling. I'm not going to bury the lead here. The final episode of Nathan For You is a feature-length documentary all about Bill Heath. In Finding Francis, Bill approached Nathan to help him track down an old flame.
So, this is the woman we're looking for.
Nathan, tantalized by the notion of solving an impossible mystery, agrees to help him. The tone of this piece is far more sincere than one would expect from the Poop Ice Cream Show. Bill once played an eccentric businessman, and now there's this underlying sadness to him. And I have to admit that watching this movie, it deeply moved me. And it's really wild to consider that against the works of, like, Eric Andre. These people are fantastic comedians, but they rarely make me feel emotions outside of shock and cringe. It's further fascinating that Nathan, a man who claims to struggle with relating to others, is then able to spin a most elegant tapestry of human emotion. Arachne with autism. Over the course of Nathan For You, Nathan plays an exaggerated version of himself. The host is an aspiring businessman with really good grades, but he's socially illiterate and awkward around women.
And as the takes went on, I was having trouble staying in character because I was really enjoying the kisses.
The incel-like behavior was initially a really big problem for me, because much of the humor that comes from the show is Nathan making people uncomfortable, and the ways in which he visibly makes these poor actresses that he hires and has power over uncomfortable blurs the line between fun and genuine discomfort.
In that moment, I felt sorry for Jesse. To share a kiss with another human and feel nothing is a horrible way to live.
It is worth noting that in real life, Nathan had a wife for most of the show, and he is definitively playing a character. But the point of all of this is that this character's ambition comes into conflict with his inability to be accepted as a human being, and in spite of his zany plans, this always brings him back down to earth. The ironic misogyny does gain a new meaning at the end of the show, which we will discuss, but as it is right now, it is purposefully difficult to interpret. Is it hubris? Is it arrogance? I'm not sure, but it is a calculated way to make sure that the ultimate butt of the joke is Nathan. All of this pretense is gone in Finding Francis. Nathan is as normal as we have ever seen him. He's funny, quick-witted, and he's even charming at times. He seriously wants to help Bill find his old flame, and he doesn't want to ironically help Bill because he's weird. He just wants to help. One of the most powerful things about Finding Frances is how it breaks down the facade of these two people. Both of them were previously comedy personas, and we'll start with Bill. We knew him as a bit character, the weird businessman, but we see that he has serious regrets in his life. Bill moved from Arkansas.
Why is this one Kansas, but this one is not Arkansas?
To Hollywood for his career in acting, a career that never really took off. He doesn't have any children or a wife, and he looks back on his relationship with Frances Gaddy with a tremendous affection. She was the one true love that he thinks he had in his life.
As he continued, I began to understand what a loss this was for him.
She cried, said, "I'll love you to my grave. I never will forget that."
That's what she said to you?
Mm-hmm. That's what she told me.
There's something akin to a heist that takes place in this movie. Nathan and Bill trick Frances' old high school into giving them a copy of their yearbook in effort to find Frances' picture. Nathan's usual shtick of manipulating people is why I often refer to him as a supervillain. He has the ability to trick people in harmless ways. He manages to get corporations to fund his escapades. We have left behind post-irony altogether, and we have arrived at something else. A meta-sincerity, where Nathan cares because he realizes that Bill is a mirror for him. They take the yearbook to a forensic aging specialist. There's an element of humor to this scene, as Frances now looks like she's been stung by a bee. But there's this moment where Nathan is confused about growing older.
I didn't know if I'd ever fully understand the science of age progression.
It becomes clear that Nathan is afraid of aging, not just of getting older, but of working so hard towards your dreams and not receiving happiness or dividends for that time. He plays this sexist oblivious character, and he doesn't make actual connections with others. Likewise, Bill lives a modest and well-organized life. He lives in a tiny apartment, and he tries to spend as little money as possible. And look, I'm a socialist. I don't think that possessions make people more valuable than another. But Bill doesn't really have much to show for his life. He has no family of his own, and even though he has some money, he keeps buying Nathan silver serving platters for some reason. But he doesn't have much to show for his career as an actor. In fact, in the next scene, he tells people that he's a brain surgeon to impress them, even though he's never met this woman.
I'm a neurosurgeon.
Okay.
In another masterstroke, Nathan decides to set up a high school reunion to try and see if anyone knows anything about Frances. And this is where I get to talk about the editing of the film, because every single choice in this comedy documentary is so artistically vibrant. Nathan keeps in a lot of technical errors. Bill's niece bumping her microphone.
Bill's dad died when he was 5 years old.
Bill looking into the character. The crew being present in the background. These moments are not for the sake of comedy, but for building a sense of authenticity. Making a documentary is a really tough process, and as someone who creates more essay-ish documentaries rather than real ones, it's hard to balance the constructive narrative with authentic life, because real life is dull and rarely worthwhile filming. The cameras follow Nathan and Bill everywhere they go.
I felt unfocused, just filming things for no reason in the hopes something interesting might happen.
Nathan is seeking to create something, and you cannot create real life. The tone of the film is humorous, and you do laugh a lot while watching it. But there is this underlying sadness to all of it, and that comes from the specific editing choices. Like, let's take this cut from Nathan explaining the plan to the audience, and then the reunion members casually chatting with one another.
But I was hopeful one of these people would have kept in touch with Frances over the years, and perhaps even know her whereabouts.
Is Dickie Schaffenberg still living?
I know JD's gone.
The weight of time suddenly hits the audience. Bill and Frances haven't seen each other in well over 50 years, as long as these seniors have been out of high school. In fact, she has been married for almost 47 years to her second husband. This isn't just a quest to find Frances for Bill. It becomes a desperate search for meaning to fill his empty life. Bill is a broken man with a broken brain. He is a person who has thought about this woman every day since he moved, and he constantly talks about how he wished he had married her, or in other words, he wished he didn't leave her for his own dreams since they didn't work out. Part of Nathan's plot to make Bill familiar with the people he didn't even go to school with is to get him singing the town's theme song. You know what? when it starts, he is pretty charismatic. He gets the crowd moving, and you kind of fall under his spell, and you start grooving as well. The edit doesn't cut away from his dance, and it makes you think that, you know what, he actually did have some talent. Which makes it all the more tragic that his acting ambitions didn't work out. He must feel so much resentment in his life. Let's switch to Nathan, because he is an incredibly bizarre host for a documentary like this. Nathan often frames himself as delusional. His hubris is bigger than the suits he wears. His belief that his insane ideas could actually work is often funnier than the reactions he elicits. He is an uncanny host in his ill-fitting blazers and bizarre mannerisms.
To experience the uncanny, then, is to experience something that is known, but something the knowledge of which has been hidden or repressed.
Philosopher Noel Cowell wrote the book The Philosophy of Horror, Paradoxes of the Heart, and I find his analysis to be relevant here. Nathan in the majority of the show is an uncanny person, one who resembles a functioning human, but acts so strangely that he is often confused and he mildly disturbs the people around him. Carroll makes a distinction early in his book between art horror, in which the medium is used to express nasty feelings about imaginary anxieties for the sake of literary catharsis, and natural horror, which concerns the cruelty of real life, a la the Holocaust. What makes Silent Hill 2 so interesting is that it blurs the line between art horror and the natural variety, where the monsters are artistic manifestations of natural feelings. Likewise in Nathan For You, Nathan is an uncanny person, due to his social illiteracy and autism. Which is where I get to talk about my own autism as I do in every single video. The works of Nathan Fielder are so incredibly autistic to me. Like, rarely have I ever felt so seen by a piece of media. This man has to plan out all of his social interactions in painstaking detail, due to his own social inadequacies. I just avoid people in general. Part of the autistic experience is that you don't understand the point of certain social rules. Thus, you become a kind of detective and amateur psychoanalyst, and you try to understand people in the most complicated way possible. Like, I do this a lot, where I'm constantly trying to understand where people are coming from emotionally because it just doesn't make sense to my brain. I overanalyze for the sake of mild understanding. Nathan literalizes this impulse by interviewing bizarre and otherwise boring people for the sake of laughing at his inability to take others at face value. The point is that Nathan is a character that is selfish, he's manipulative, he lies, and he is weird in regards to women. But what makes him likable is that he's aware of all of these tendencies in himself, and it's just that his autism just makes him come across as a prick. Not to imply that autism is a natural horror or scary in and of itself. Rather, these scary feelings and the awkward cringe you feel for Nathan read as uncanny because he's trying so hard to be a person, and the very trying is what makes him come across as uncanny. Contrasting with Silent Hill, a franchise full of heightened emotions that are difficult to process, Nathan For You also features absurd characters that are hard to understand. They both exist in uncanny space. They look like real people, sometimes they even talk like real people, but something is off. They are obviously manufactured, and the protagonists of each series are bad people who are trying to do better, who often are deceived by others, but more often than not themselves. Both properties are about the horrors of being autistic in a neurotypical world. Send tweet. In Finding Frances, Nathan speaks to Bill's niece. Nathan wants to learn as much about Bill as he can in order to help him, and there's this scene where she reveals that Bill only started doing Gates impersonations once he joined the show.
Did I say for a living?
You do this for a living, right?
Yes, sir.
This is the first time that we are confronted with the fact that Bill is a prolific and entitled liar. He lied to Nathan about the specifics of his relationships to Frances and his promiscuity with other women. He doesn't necessarily lie out of malice or a desire to hurt people, but he lies because he wants others to view him with kinder eyes, to see a version of himself he wishes he was reflected back to him in others' praise.
And I think there's just different points of his life that he's just kind of felt, you know, that maybe he's been entitled to certain things and life doesn't always work out that way. And I think that's harder for him to move past.
This entitlement manifests in his image of Frances. There is this scene early on which gains a haunting quality on subsequent viewings, where Nathan innocently asks Bill what his favourite memory of her is, as if they were two schoolboys talking about their crushes, and he just bluntly replies,
Probably when we were on the bed there together.
When you were on the bed together?
Yeah.
What did you do on the bed?
Well, I was trying to have sex with her.
Oh, cool.
It becomes very clear that Bill doesn't remember Frances Gaddy as a person who had wants and dreams. He has reified her into a masturbatory fantasy. Masturbatory in this context does not only refer to the literal act of its namesake, but as an action that is done to please the self rather than to help others. Bill uses Frances to justify some of his life choices. If only he had married her, his life would have been alright. There's obviously that sexual element to it as well, but he doesn't view Frances as a person. Reification, then, it means that he has abstracted and simplified her down to her body and not her mind. This is not to say that sex cannot be as emotionally important to people as more mundane memories are, but it is alarming to see a man who has spent the last 50 odd years thinking about this woman every single day, and he can't think of anything else other than an awkward sexual encounter he had as a teenager that was presumably uncomfortable for Frances herself. It is tremendously creepy, and it colours every single utterance of her name afterwards. It doesn't matter what Frances wants, she only exists in Bill's mind to gratify him. She is a figure of Lamentations, and Nathan slowly realises that this process is the core of Bill's misery. As Nathan becomes disillusioned with Bill Heath, he starts to look elsewhere for emotional connection. It was around this time that Nathan privately went through a divorce. And I don't want to linger on it because it's none of my business, but it is very curious that a large chunk of the remaining screen time is filled with Nathan's flirtations with Macy, an escort specializing in older clients.
You've never been on camera?
No.
Oh, really?
Never.
Is it weird for you?
It is a little weird, yeah.
Okay.
Nathan originally approached Macy to set up a date with Bill to see if he would act courteously around women he's attracted to, but he blows off the date, so Nathan goes ahead and meets her just for an interview, just to get inside of Bill's head. And then they meet for a second time, a third, and a fourth. Nathan falls for Macy, and despite it being her job, she seems to gain some affection for him. Macy is the first person in the show to question Nathan's artifice. She is somewhat uncomfortable with the cameras that film them, so she vocalizes this.
You're a little funny.
Okay.
Kind of mean, but you're a little
Mean?
funny, yeah.
What do you mean?
You lied to every last one of them.
I mean, it's
You're
business.
like mean funny.
And her honesty seems to shock his posture and endear her to him. She wishes to connect with Nathan, not the business advisor who had really good grades. With this documentary being the finale of the series, it seems that Nathan is reflecting on his character's sexism, and he is questioning the metaphysics of hosting a show like this. This examination is not solely just on the character, but the very point of documentary filmmaking itself. There is this elongated shot of the two of them just kissing in a hotel room. And I think about this so much. This fascinates me as someone who edits most every single day, because we tend to look at editing as nothing more than an assembly of shots. But what you choose to keep in changes the tone of this entire piece. Nathan seems to be self-aware that the tone of his documentary is terribly critical of old Bill, so he ought to put himself under the microscope as well. Nathan sees Bill as a mirror. His own career as a comedian might have cost him his marriage, and that's why I think he includes so many segments of Macy, because it shows the pleasures of following one's passions. It would be easy to conclude that Bill wasted his life needlessly suffering. Bill has wasted his life. He has no family, because he's been saving himself for a woman that he can't find. Sometimes he cried himself to sleep over it, over his guilt for not marrying her, not at all considering that this was something that she might want. And all just for and all of this effort, and all of this time, and all of this boredom for just a short phone call. It's harrowing to me how Lamentations will drive someone to live miserably. Like, look at this scene. The pair find a real name in the dress of Frances, and Bill scowls and grows bitter as he learns that she is happily married.
She could have done better than that.
He's not Mr. Good Looking, I don't think.
He's an attorney. He looks like he's overweight. I should have married her. Should have married her.
He keeps repeating, "She would love me to my grave," over and over, as if he's trying to find a way to wrap his head around the fact that she could be happy without him. Nathan grows incredibly worried that he might do something outlandish, as his passion has overtaken his reason. So he hires an actress to play Frances, and her performance has a major impact on Bill. Lamentations, masturbatory fantasies, and doubles. Chapter 4, Accretion. Look, I'm sick of sitting behind this desk, so I'm going to try and do something a little bit different this time. Because you are media savvy, you know that I'm about to make some galaxy-brained observations about the horror of loving others. But before we can do that, we need to do some philosophy. Because I'm fun at parties. I'm joking, I don't go to parties. Dialectics is a method of philosophical inquiry, in which you try to accept two contradictory ideas at the same time. Philosophers do this in order to learn what opposing ideas have in common, and what they can tell us about the nature of the world. We're going to talk about consciousness, and there are many dialectics of consciousness, most famously Hegel's master-slave dialectic, but I don't give a shit about Hegel, because he was an anti-Semite, and he had bad opinions about art and empathy. A video about that is coming quite soon. So I want to present two extremes, to see how they both must be accepted at the same time so we can understand everything else. Simple enough, let's give a brief history of consciousness. The question of what makes a person the same person over time is a complicated one, and as a baseline we need to talk about some John Locke, who you will likely know from your Metaphysics 101 class. What makes a person the same over time is not based solely on genetics. Someone might gain amnesia and turn out to be a very different person than who they were when they were before the accident. Locke argued that memory is what connects us from our inner child. We are the same because we remember what it felt like to be them. Amnesia means that when we wake up we don't recall ourselves. Thus, we are ourselves when we remember what it was like to be us before we slept. This is the general line of logic when we watch body swap movies, and we accept the same consciousness is themselves even though they inhabit a different body. Under Locke's person-state theories, our person is not tied to our body or even our brain. The classic retort to John Locke's theory is that if you have a pensioner who has committed terrible war crimes but he medically has dementia, that means he shouldn't be punished because he simply isn't the same person anymore. Right? And likewise, if the perpetrator says that he can't remember the crime that he committed 20 years ago, then under John Locke's model, he ought to go free. It's like logically sound, but it's a notion that feels wrong in our bellies, and it's a pretty effective criticism. The dementia-ridden old man deserves to be held accountable in some way rather than being set free.
I'm free!
So another theory goes that it is the people that are around us that maintain our sense of self. Our parents remember us from when we were kids, and they tell us stories from our childhood. And if we remember those stories, then we can trust that we are the same people over time. This is Thomas Reid, and he argued in favor of an episodic model of memory. You might not remember where you were 2 Wednesdays ago, or what you ate for lunch on that particular day, but you likely recall a time where you do remember that experience. So, through a chain of episodic memories, we can remain assured that we are the same person who we were over the course of our lives. Under this line of logic, you might retort that babies are thus not people, to which I would say that they are simply people in waiting to be developed and to create their own chains of memory. It is not that their lives aren't as valuable as the adults around them, but it's because they don't have a consciousness as we would describe it. I implore you, do not take this line of argumentation to infringe upon the rights of the mentally disabled either. So we have person states and we have the episodic model. And this is generally speaking most people's baseline understanding of how consciousness works. But I've always felt dissatisfied with this as the perfect answer, because it doesn't explain why we feel passionate or why we feel terror over our sense of consciousness. Thus, I want to design my own dialectic with both passion and terror in mind. Both of the authors I will mention describe themselves as amateur philosophers at most, and they're too concerned with their actual day jobs to pontificate about being a ghost in machines, so keep that in mind as we go forward. Gotta find the book now. Ugh, the bones. The first half of this dialectic comes from Douglas Hofstadter, part cognitive psychologist, part physicist, part philosopher. In his book, I Am a Strange Loop, he attempts to communicate his personal theory of human consciousness. In our experience of consciousness, we tend to reference ourselves into infinity. I am because I am because I am because I am. You get the gist. This is because our consciousness feels more complicated than a mere chain of memories, because our chains refer to other chains, and there is this curious relational factor that goes unspoken most of the time. We don't just remember memories, but we relate our memories back to art and poems and books and the things that have inspired us artistically. For example, Angus as an I was delighted by the film Old Boy, and he was very frustrated by the Book of Henry. He was greatly moved by Silent Hill 2, but he was very frustrated by the movies.
That look like a gang tag to you?
It is not that I remember myself being enthralled by these works specifically, but it's the fact that they actively inform how I view the world and how I consume art today. Thus, consciousness is not in the shape of a branching tree, but rather, it looks like a video camera filming its own feedback. I as a pronoun refers to this endless loop of self-reference. Hofstadter opened his book on a quiet moment he shared with his mother. She was looking at a picture of her recently deceased husband, and she grew angry at herself because this lifeless piece of paper and ink made her emotional. Hofstadter then sat quietly for a second, and looked at his mum and compared this photo to a book of classical music. Like, sure, it is just ink and paper, but the connections our brain make to that stimulus creates beautiful moments. The art of Frederick Chopin, is it Chopin? Chopin. It doesn't matter, he's an anti-Semite. Connects us with Chopin himself, and this is special because we can once experience what was in his brain. Thus, our memories of our deceased father, given back to us by a photo of him after he has died, uses the same kind of mental pathways as his live presence provoked.
In such a potent fashion, looking at that photograph of Dad brings back, to us who knew him intimately, the clearest memory of his smile and his gentleness. Activates inside our living brains some of the most central representations of him that survive in us. Makes little fragments of his soul dance again, but in the medium of our brains other than his own. Like the score to a Chopin etude, that photograph is a soul shard of someone departed, and it is something that we should cherish for as long as we live.
I think that this half of the dialectic can be represented by Nathan Fielder. His view of Bill Heath is tragic, to be sure, but seeing Bill care so much about someone from his youth is deeply human and strangely beautiful. Our experience of consciousness is more complicated than a string of memories. It feels like the people who love us, hate us, change us. We are them and they are us. And he spends the rest of his book trying to scientifically prove how this strange loop works. Because if pictures can give us pleasure whilst we're in pain, then what else are we alive for? Thomas Ligotti is an infamous party pooper. He's a horror author by trade, and his book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, is the kind of book that you read, thoroughly agree with, and then you desperately try not to think about too much because its premises are suicidal and its conclusions are anti-natalist. It is a definitive yuff. Ligotti was thoroughly unconvinced about consciousness being a thing of beauty, on life being alright, as he puts it. It's the opposite, really. He feels that being conscious of our own suffering is the worst curse imaginable, because it's like the fact that Sisyphus was aware of his fate is what makes his punishment so tragic.
Consciousness is an existential liability, as every pessimist agrees. To make it through this life, we must make believe that we are not who we are. Contradictory beings whose continuance only worsens our plight as mutants who embody the contorted logic of a paradox.
Consciousness is a blunder, and the part of this blunder is that we are the only creatures who understand for the vast majority of our lives that we will die one day. And this goes much deeper than life is unfair, man. Ligotti argues that we know that we will die, we know that we are unhappy, but our very being demands that we live in full awareness of these things, and that in and of itself is tremendously cruel.
What doomed us, if one will forgive another imperious repetition of this theme, was consciousness. Parent of all horrors and author of all. We believe we should be and should not be. While consciousness brought us out of our coma in the natural, we still like to think that, however aloof we are from other living things, we are not in essence wholly alienated from them. It is no fault of ours that we were made as we were made, experiments in a parallel being. This is not our choice. We did not volunteer to be as we are. We may think that being alive is alright, especially when we consider the alternative, but we think about it as infrequently as possible, for this very thought raises the spirits of the dead and all the other freaks of nature. No other forms of life know they are alive.
To be conscious is to suffer, and we are worse off than any other creatures on this planet because we are conscious of our suffering. So according to Ligotti, it is impossible to find joy in life because life just isn't worth it as it is right now. We feel as if we should be happy because it's a societal value. Happy people do more work, but we are rarely happy, and it becomes a social taboo to not be happy, so thus we then medicalize existential suffering. Permit me like another moment to be a socialist.
Slap my salami, the guy's a commie.
Because there's a similar line of reasoning found in Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, where he argues that we medicalize depression and anxiety so that we don't have to confront how capitalism fosters depression and anxiety. Our consciousness works against us, urging us to end ourselves to end our suffering. We thus are conscious puppets, incapable of plasticity. As I said, dude's a big party pooper. Even though I love his book dearly, I do have many critiques of Ligotti. Like, what he says about, like, transhumanism is very boomer to me. But for now, I argue that Ligotti's pessimism is spiritually akin to the Silent Hill franchise, even though it predates the writing of said book. James is miserable because he cannot escape his own consciousness. In Silent Hill 2, he is constantly confronted with what he did to Mary, and of all the nasty things that he felt, so he longs to die rather than to remember a second of it. We then have two different models of consciousness. Ligotti would be contemptuous of Hofstadter's picture as it promotes needless suffering, whereas Hofstadter would argue against the unscientific nature of Ligotti's arguments. They would definitely be at odds, but together they form a really interesting dialectic. It's optimistic warmth versus cold pessimism. Let's be centrist and meet in the middle then. The base assumption of Ligotti is that life is in fact not alright, that we are born without our consent and we are left to suffer and hurt others until we die. Hofstadter believes that life is likewise pain and that suffering is inevitable, but we can make it better for ourselves and others. So the way in which we understand these two wildly different perspectives on the value of life is conduct. How do we exist and be good people? It's important to note that, like, Ligotti isn't being nihilistic as an excuse to be, like, an asshole. He doesn't think that violence is permissible because everything is meaningless, man. Rather, we ought to stop kidding ourselves into thinking that we matter a terrible amount. A day will come for each of us, so we ought not to worry about death and suffering because we are all born to die and we will all suffer in the meantime. Further, Ligotti does not think that suffering is good or that it builds character. Rather, we may have just been better off not being born in the first place because suffering and pain are inevitable and pervasive. James spent many years with Mary while she was ill, and it drew on for so long that he began to feel guilty resentment at her for it. The previously mentioned hallway argument is illustrative here.
Are you still here? I told you to go! Are you deaf?
If we leave the hallway when she asks us to, we are significantly more likely to get the worst ending in the game, the Maria one, because James is reinforcing the manufactured cruelty of Mary, and we fall for the idealized, even more manufactured illusion of Maria. We ignore reality, we ignore our capacity for suffering, and we delude ourselves with illusions to not confront the trauma and sadness of it all. When Mary pleads for us not to leave her when she's dying, we are facing her humanity and her frailty head on. In not living in denial, we are confronting the nature of suffering and pain, and we get a more authentic ending. Like, even if James kills himself, at least he isn't delusional, so averse to the nature of suffering, so in denial of his own circumstance, that he walks off into the fog with a coughing Maria. The authors of this dialect demand that you face suffering head on, even if the prescription is not the same, because while being alive might not be alright, how we conduct ourselves when we are actually alive is what is important. I'm going to stop being silly for a moment, and I'm going to talk about Hofstadter's book some more, because it's really dense and hard to follow, but the best part of it, in my opinion, are chapters 16 and 17, where he grapples with the death of his wife, Carol. These chapters are built around him trying to apply his own model of looping consciousness to give meaning to her death. It is worth noting that she, like Mary, died of an elongated illness. With this new context, Douglas recalls the conversation he had with his mother, and he observes that when two people are around each other for a very long time, say 50 years, like his mum was around his dad, they become a fluent beer of the other person. They are able to intuit what their partner would likely say and do in a particular situation.
Although it took me several years to learn to be Carol, and although I certainly never reached the native speaker level, I think it's fair to say that, at our time of greatest closeness, I was a fluent beer of my wife. I shared so many of her memories, both from our joint times and from times before we ever met. I knew so many of the people who had formed her. I loved so many of the same pieces of music, books, friends, jokes. I shared so many of her most intimate desires and hopes. So her point of view, her interiority, herself, which had originally been instantiated in just one brain, came to have a second instantiation, although that one was far less complete and intricate than the original one.
He then goes on to passionately argue that Carol isn't actually dead because part of her consciousness exists within him and his family. And sure, he doesn't have as complete a copy of her as his wife did, but she left an impact on him, a hole, if you will. And following this logic, if consciousness is a strange loop, then the fact that we reference other people means that we are them and they are us.
We are all curious collages, weird little planetoids that grow by accreting other people's habits and ideas and styles and tics and jokes and phrases and tunes and hopes and fears, as if they were all meteorites that came soaring out of the blue, collided with us, and stuck. What at first is an artificial alien mannerism slowly fuses into the stuff of ourself, like wax melting in the sun, and gradually becomes as much as part of us as it ever was of someone else, though that person may very well have borrowed it from someone else to begin with. Although my meteorite metaphor may make it sound as if we are victims of random bombardment, I don't mean to make it sound as if we willingly accrete just any old mannerism onto our sphere's surface. We are very selective, usually borrowing traits that we admire or covet, but even our style of selectivity is itself influenced over the years by what we have turned into as a result of our repeated accretions.
I cried a little bit when I read this for the first time. I find this sentiment to be intensely beautiful, and it's what keeps me going whenever Ligotti invades my brain. If we were to be mean and grumpy, we could consider Hofstadter's grief here as a kind of abstract cope, in which focusing on suffering creates a kind of reverse utilitarianism, and focusing on the dead is pointless because they're dead and they can't do anything. But I would be lying to you if I didn't say that I feel Hofstadter in my bones. I've been changed by the people that I loved. I see what they used to wear, or I listen to something they used to like, and their memory comes flooding back into my mind. Even if we no longer speak, and we might not like each other very much on a personal level. The fact that I have the capacity to be fluent in another person's verbs reminds me of my affection of them. The self-referential model of consciousness is how I view my own personhood. Life is suffering. Knowing others is suffering. And life might not be alright. But the fact that we can change and be changed for the better by people who we admire, and for whom we share love for art, is a deeply important concept to me. James feels so much grief because such a major part of his self died with Mary. And even if he had these disgusting feelings in his head, they were all secondary to wanting Mary to be alright. Likewise in Finding Francis, Nathan views Macy with reverence. He sees what Bill has become, a husk of a man with no positive memories, and Nathan decides to follow his passions and continue to do what feels right to him. Both of their stories in the documentary intertwine, but the results are parallel to one another. To me, both of these books and their assigned pieces of media, they represent a spectrum of ways to cope with these lamentations. They can be beautiful, but we can also deal with them in tremendously unhealthy ways. Because if we dig a hole in our hearts for another person to sit, and then we part with them on less than optimal terms, we can potentially spend the rest of our lives, as Bill Heath has, trying to fill it with false memories and perceptions of them, leading to a pessimism and a misery that only Ligotti described. Chapter 5, Projection. This chapter will focus on the interactions between characters in both properties. I will note that in Silent Hill, there are fan theories that characters like Angela are not physical beings like James is. Rather, they are emotional reflections like Maria is. But I think that makes the game less interesting. Like, sure, these characters can represent James's anger and depression, but they aren't mutually exclusive with being actual manifestations. So I'm going to assume that they are lost souls like James is, and they were attracted to Silent Hill because they cannot handle their own suffering in a healthy way. Author's note, there is no real way to cope with the horrific violence that Angela's father wrought, but she is diving into delusion instead of seeking clinical help. Sexual assault survivors are not delusional or incapable of help. This game does not argue that, and neither do I. The first person that James bumps into in Silent Hill is Angela. Both of them are groggy, uncanny, and surprised to see one another. She warns James not to enter the town, and he tells her,
I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not.
He's clearly delusional and suicidal, and part of why this game is regarded as so sensitive around these topics is that he doesn't come across as crazy. Because we get it. It may have been 3 years since her death, but James is still reeling, and instead of healing and arriving at acceptance, he reverts back and forth between bargaining and depression. Personally, the thing about the 5 stages of grief is that they aren't always linear, and they aren't always all there. You also can't really tell what stage you're in. Like, I recall grieving myself, and I had a really rough month, and I was like, you know what? I've gone through it, and I've now arrived at acceptance. And then my therapist was like, dude, you haven't even gotten out of denial yet. Grief can be really funny to look back upon sometimes because it messes with your brain. You aren't able to understand the mist until you look at it from far away. Angela is a fascinating character because she's the most sympathetic person in the game. She has been hurt the most and we feel the sorriest for her, but she has been all consumed by her trauma. She sees flames where we see fog. She's the only character, other than James, to be present during a boss fight against a monster that looks like one person having their own relations with another underneath a blanket. With the walls of the room, and since Angela is right next to all of this, we can put 2 and 2 together. It is never stated outright, but it is heavily implied that Angela was assaulted by her father and her brother. She's the most emotionally unstable, and that's distinct from the unhinged behavior of Eddie, because she's kind to James, but she cusses him out. She blames him, and then she apologizes. Victims of assault often struggle to accept that they didn't deserve said violence, especially if they're children, because children tend to see their parents as the arbiters of moral purity. So if they are hurt by their parents, they are very likely to justify the violence as if they deserved it. Further, they often feel a sense of shame in retrospect for not fighting against their abusers, which compounds the trauma in a looping malignant sense of what if. This guilt is further compounded with the implication, found in a newspaper in the game, that Angela killed her abusive father in self-defense. To quote Dr. Judith Herman,
feelings of rage and murderous revenge fantasies are normal responses to abusive treatment. Child victims often lack verbal and social skills for resolving conflict, and they approach problems with the expectation of hostile attack. The child entrapped in this kind of horror develops the belief that she is somehow responsible for the crimes of her abusers. Simply by virtue of her existence on Earth, she believes that she has driven the most powerful people in her world to do terrible things. Surely then, her nature must be thoroughly evil. The language of the self becomes a language of abomination.
Angela first gives the knife to James after they meet a second time. But it's before we meet Maria, and Angela recognizes herself in James.
You're the same as me. It's easier just to run. Besides, is what we deserve.
And this knife represents self-harm. James doesn't throw the knife away because he accepts that he deserves to die for what he did to Mary. And any reasonable person would understand that euthanasia is referred to as that because the patient wants to die. But James feels guilty because an unflattering part of him wanted the illness to take Mary away from him so that he can move on, return to his normal life, and arrive at acceptance, and then find happiness. He struggles with these feelings, and that's why he came to Silent Hill. He can't accept his own guilt, so he desperately searches for someone to absolve him of his pain in his heart. Angela sees right through him. She searches for her mother amidst the flames because she too needs someone to relieve her of her guilt. It is implied that Angela's mother knew about the abuse and did nothing, so she mirrors James and his own guilt for ending Mary's life. Angela is last seen in the hotel where Mary and James once shared a happy vacation. She is sitting in a stairwell on fire. The wall has a manifestation of the bedroom boss from earlier. Now that James is privy to Angela's trauma, he and we see the flames. James breaks her out of her delusion, in which she mistakes us for her mother.
Thank you for saving me. But I wish you hadn't. Even Mama said it. I deserved what happened.
No, Angela, that's wrong.
We then cut to James's point of view, in which she begins to chide us, the player. The camera becomes unstable, perhaps unwilling to look her dead in the eye, representing how little we can actually do to help her.
Or maybe you think you can save me. Will you love me? Take care of me? Heal all my pain? That's what I thought.
James isn't in Silent Hill to help anyone but himself. It's all suicidal, as Angela has always known. She understands James better than any of us, and she confirms what she suspected. She asks for the knife back, and meekly James protests. I don't want to kill myself, which is a weak lie. He came here in the first place because he would rather be dead than continue ruminating. James might sincerely want to help Angela, but it's fruitless. And what this means for us, the player, is that we tend to romanticize mental illness and trauma. It makes someone interesting. But the second traumatized people do something actually uncomfortable or strange, the second they get triggered by a bad memory, people don't want anything to do with them. And this is represented by Angela walking back up the flame-soaked stairs.
It's hot as hell in here.
You see it too. For me, it's always like this.
Where James's trauma corrodes his mental health like rust on a fence, Angela's trauma repels people as the fire in the stairwell does. He can't help her because James doesn't wish to. He can't take the heat of actually caring for someone else because he's lost in his own narcissistic dream. You might object that these two relations aren't actually analogous. Angela's mother was implied to be complicit with her daughter's violence, whereas James was asked by Mary to end her suffering. Good observation. The parallel is to highlight the absurdity of James's guilt complex. Angela is still a real person in the narrative, but the narrative was crafted with this irony to reflect how James doesn't see his dead wife as a person who really existed. He wishes to revert her back several person states to a time before the disease, to when she was last happy in Silent Hill.
What do you think? Is the look pretty accurate?
Yes.
Yeah?
Not bad.
In order to see how Bill Heath might behave around Frances, Nathan hires an actress to play her, to rehearse for the most important moment of Bill's life. They gave the actress June access to Frances's letters.
He disappointed her and hurt her.
Bill is thus rehearsing with a younger version of Frances, a different person state. No shade to June, who is lovely and fantastic in her part of this rehearsal. Throughout the documentary, Bill frames the fact that he didn't marry Frances as everyone else's fault. If he married her, he would own her. And as we have discussed, he cheated on her and pushed her away for his own aspiring career in Hollywood. He has an obvious shame about this, and it compounds his regrets. It is quite alarming that, off the bat, Bill is incredibly handsy with June. Because June is simultaneously playing a younger version of herself and this masturbatory reified formulation of Frances, Bill gets confused between these three versions of Frances that he has in his head. The young version of Frances he was actually in love with, the older version of Frances which Bill has created, and the manufactured version in front of him. What is so alarming about this is he doesn't see any of them as people. They are all Lamentations, constructed versions of a woman, because if she were here in front of him right now, he wouldn't treat her with humanity.
He just couldn't engage with Frances like a normal human being.
Surprise!
The most fascinating part of this rehearsal is when they give Bill a wig and tell him to play the role of Frances and ask June to be Bill, in order for Bill to actually understand how he is coming across, and for the first time in decades to actually see her as a person. Another alarming moment is when he starts ranting from her point of view about how if he were Frances, he would have cried himself to sleep every night.
You don't know how I've cried myself to sleep thinking of you. Losing sleep for hours. Well, it's like when a person kills somebody, they're sorry, but that doesn't bring them back to life.
It's pretty obvious that he's projecting here. At the same time, it is self-hatred, but he also remains unable to view a version of Frances in which she could be happy without him. Because if that were actually the case for this married woman, then it would justify the amount of time he has spent thinking about her. It is only after this exercise that Bill begins to stop feeling so angry, and he accepts that his own behavior is what drove her away.
I cheated on you. I kept you misleading that we were going to marry. I didn't answer your letters. I've been living with regret. It was really hard.
Bill connects with those letters because, as Hofstadter described, they reactivated the mental pathways that recall how he actually felt about Frances. But due to the years of reification and abstraction, he was unable to view Frances as a person who was separate from himself. She is the perfect woman, no gripes with his behaviour at all, and once there is a hint of indignation in her tone, he ignores it to satisfy himself. It is only after he accepts his own role in his misery that he's able to view her as a person rather than a reified character and sex object.
Maria?
You said you took everything.
James was in his late 20s. He and Mary were likely to be something akin to high school sweethearts, and they were married for a significant amount of time. Mary has been sick for such a long time, and it has been 3 years since her death that when we actually start the game, so we can say that James's perception of Mary has warped in his life. The memory of her vibrance was quite literally subject to decay. The classic 101 analysis will be borrowed here for a moment. The monsters you fight in the game are often clusters of legs, which part to attack you, the vagina dentata, and when we enter Brookhaven Hospital, we see scantily clad nurses. We enter the same hospital in Silent Hill 3, and the nurses are dressed more conservatively, and there is no pyramid head in sight, so in this case we see James's repressed desires for the women around him. I don't think that James is necessarily entitled here because he doesn't act on his desires or hurt anyone else other than himself. But the game is displaying his repressed sexuality in the form of enemies that try to harm him. To quote Brian DeLint,
they can also be seen as a representation of James's tendency of hatred towards women because of his wife's inability to satisfy his needs. The monsters popping up in James's psychotherapeutic process signifies him dealing with these feelings, and the player's choice in ignoring these enemies or taking the time to kill them can be seen as indicative of how the process takes place. Either James ignores these gnawing feelings of doubt, or faces them head on.
James isn't an explicit misogynist in the game. Like, he's a bit rude to Angela when he first meets her, but that could just be attributed to both of them having a hallucinogenic headspace. But it is definitely fair to say that he has internalized his misogyny, a distortion of a healthy reciprocal sexual relationship with women more generally. The nurses become demented, the legs part, and the creatures with restrained arms shoot acid from the tips of their heads. Desire becomes acidic, and he beats himself up for even having these feelings in the first place. He experiences a toxic cycle of guilt and shame that swirls down the drain. He resents women and Mary in particular because they control access to sex. His final words with Angela cement this, as he isn't willing to look an abuse survivor in the eye and actually help her through her trauma. James's desires are for himself alone.
You ready?
Ready.
Throughout finding Frances, you feel the weight of impossibility, and then they suddenly find her, and we bear witness to their reunion. It's a reunion that Bill is too nervous to do in person, so he calls her from outside her home. Bill has been waiting for this moment for the majority of his adult life, and it is phenomenal to see such an important and tender moment, so special to another. This is a beautiful moment that is also metaphysically terrifying because, and I speak purely from personal experience, when you think about someone every day, every hour, while you're out and about, you try desperately to maintain them. And these ruminations destroy the essence of their memory. They cease to have agency in your mind and you flanderize them. They're overly cruel, overly submissive, overly sexual, overly distant. Bill Heath desperately hopes that Frances would recognize his voice.
Well, you think hard. Doesn't my voice sound familiar to you?
No. And when she doesn't, Bill is utterly crushed. This is because, if she did recognize his voice, it would be validation for all the time he spent thinking about her. He slowly realizes over the course of this 15-minute phone call that she hasn't been thinking about him as he has been her. He projects his own misery onto her, convincing himself that she feels the same way, because if she did, then his needless suffering wouldn't have needed to be so needless. He has convinced himself that he would recognize her voice and intonation when 50-some years of time and memories have crafted a new timbre. Bill doesn't want Frances as she is right now. He wants her back when they were teenagers.
Have you thought about me much through the years?
Of course.
Do you ever want to pick up the phone and call me?
Of course.
But you never did.
He asked that last question to convince himself that, if she did care, she would have had a similar level of emotional investment in him as he does her. After the call ends and they wish each other goodbye, Bill sits quietly with Nathan and he looks into the camera for just a second. The choice to insert that clip where there's no dialogue implies that Bill might be censoring himself for the camera some. Not that the way that the phone call would have been conducted differently, but his subdued nature is in some ways calculated. Later in that evening, Bill and Nathan are in their hotel room, and Bill tries desperately to swat a bug. A moment so Freudian in conception that it's hilarious. He's lost all hopes of getting back together with Frances, and he attempts to control the smallest things to give himself agency. Much later, after Bill and Nathan have returned home, Bill asks for June's phone number, and he asks her if she recognizes his voice.
Do you know who you're speaking with?
Is this Bill?
Yeah, this is Bill.
The film plays it off as sweet, but if we consider it alongside Silent Hill 2, it's a bit ghoulish. The following voiceover says,
"It's easy to look at someone else's life as a cautionary tale. After all, no one wants to be old and filled with regret. But if you look closer and see that that life is filled with moments of sincere joy, however fleeting, it's hard to say if it was really a bad life after all."
We then see Nathan reunite with Macy. The previous line was part of a letter that he sent her, and we see the two of them together again. Nathan, as the awkward persona and the scripted character, breaks free and follows his joy. He wants to follow his opportunities until they end naturally, because then that minimizes the chance of ruminations, the dreaded question of what if.
Anyways, I wanted to let you know that I booked my ticket yesterday. I'm really excited to see you.
The greatest thing about Macy, not only the positive portrayal of a sex worker as a normal person, is that she is a skeptic of the film. She constantly calls Nathan out for the manufactured nature of his show, because the both of them are performers. But the difference between them is that she trades in genuine connection.
If I feel like I'm going to connect with you, I know I'm going to have a good time, and you're probably going to have a good time too.
Nathan, meanwhile, trades in dishonesty, in tricking every single last one of them. And do not get me wrong, his art and his show are fantastic. I really love it all if it isn't clear at this point. He is an autistic genius, and I will definitely be talking about him again on this channel. But their differing relationship styles and Maisie's frank honesty implores Nathan to be more authentic. This is most explicit in the ending, where she asks what the audience is thinking.
It's kind of weird having cameras around, right?
Do you want to?
I feel like does that defeat the purpose?
What's the purpose?
You're filming something. It's kind of the purpose, right?
She puts Nathan on the spot and softly seeks his authenticity. As the final scene of Nathan's video, Nathan learns to move away from post-irony and sincerely engage with the nature of love. He seemingly decides to help people because it's the right thing to do. The show, The Rehearsal, is entirely about helping strange people rehearse for small problems, putting hundreds of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars into otherwise insignificant trifles, a lie, a tense confrontation. And that's Nacy to a T. Sincere and honest. A drone flies away from the scene, and it reveals the camera crew, the sound people, and the drone pilots. It's such a fitting end to the exaggerated version of Nathan's character. In The Rehearsal, he isn't weird around women, and while he is still a bit manipulative, he feels more like a real person. In fact, he gets lost in his narcissism, a lesson not learned from Bill, and he actively confronts how he has hurt people, like in the final episode of that show with the little boy. But that's another video for another day.
You could be her twin.
As has been established many times, Maria is an over-sexualized and more confident version of Mary. We rarely get glimpses into Maria, but we feel the power of their difference, solely based off of James' reaction to her. As we get further into the game, Maria gains more agency. From the other side of a prison cell, she tells James,
"I'm not your Mary."
So, you're Maria?
I am. If you want me to be, it doesn't matter who I am. I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real.
James desperately tries to suppress his guilt, to control his own suicidality, and this is represented by a seductive Maria. During this segment, the camera is always looking up Maria's skirt. In another game, I would call this crass titillation, but this desperation takes the form of an erotic seduction. Logically, it makes no sense for James to have come to Silent Hill. The note that originally brought him here in the first place has faded away to nothing at this point in the game. But there is an emotional compulsion here. James, like Bill, has destroyed his loving memories of Mary, and he has replaced them with degrading screams and the fear of death. He feels utterly impotent without her. There is a small moment in Brookhaven Hospital where James tries to open a fridge in the floor, but he can't shift it by himself. But when he comes back later with Maria, he's able to open it.
Maria, give me a hand here.
Come on. You're supposed to be the big man around here. How's a little girl like me supposed to help?
She then pulls a lead wedding ring out of the fridge and gives it to James. The game is doing two important things here. It highlights James's belief that he is impotent as a man, incapable of protecting his wife from death, and this is strengthened by Maria's teasing and questioning his masculinity, when it doesn't really matter at all if Maria is stronger than him. At the same time, it highlights his codependence on Mary, in which he feels like he can't do anything without her, which is a belief which chafes against his sexual resentment of her. The final boss of the game is Mary in a bed, and it is up to us to kill this warped memory, and depending on how we have played James, we might end up with something worse.
But I can be yours. I'll be here for you forever. And I'll never yell at you, or make you feel bad.
This playthrough, I made sure to get the leave ending, in which James leaves the town with little Laura, mirroring the end of Silent Hill 1. Many fans, and some developers, believe that the in-water ending is the most logical ending for James. A man so transfixed by his own grief that he can't even imagine a world without ruminations. To quote Brian de Lint,
depression is often described by its sufferers to feel like you are drowning, or linked to water in imagery, such as a permanent torrential rain that rains down only on a depressed person. The prevalence of symbolism relating to water can be seen as another allusion to James's depression, especially when seen as a projection screen for the inner journey.
Mary likely had a family, and they're also struggling. James never mentions the fact that he has people with which he can share his grief with. He has become so selfish that the only logical thing to do is to harm himself rather than dare to find happiness for himself and others. The ending monologue is genuinely one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my entire life. It's important to note that every duck has two eyes, and Mary is as important as Maria. I feel unequipped to speak about this monologue as it ruins me every single time I hear it. I will start bawling if I try to analyze it, because I understand every single emotion here. And I'm not just making aesthetic observations of this piece of art. I lived every single moment of this. I've had many strange relations with many different people throughout my life, and I have been them and they have been me. But I want to use my own mental state to articulate this from a first-person perspective. The following is something private I wrote after my first viewing of Finding Frances, because it destroyed me emotionally and it healed me a little bit as well. I have modified it slightly to fit more broadly into the themes of the video, but this essay was the prototype for this video. I still find Hofstadter's book to be intensely beautiful, but I realized in writing this that I am a living retort, a Ligotti-esque critique about the follies of remembering. Because it is beautiful in theory, but I strongly believe, with every fiber of my being, that ruminating on someone can actually diminish their personhood, and how it can further harm you. Consider this to be a loving retort to Hofstadter. I should say that I'm fine, by the way. I've worked through all of this.
Anything I talked to you about tonight on stage, I've dealt with it, I've processed it. That's why I'm telling you. Like, the fact I'm telling you lets you know it's fine now. Because, and don't take this badly, but you lot are never going to be the first people I'll come to.
I present to you the fruits of my own lamentation so that you can recognize your own feelings in yourself and correct to ensure that your relationships are healthy. Chapter 6. Rumination. You might think about someone every single day. Sometimes they're a good person. More often than not, they were very bad to you. Sometimes they're an ex-partner. Sometimes they're a guardian. They leave an impact on you. They leave a hole. You remember them so vividly that you can almost feel the heat of their scornful gaze. You might think about someone every day, every hour, sometimes every few. Sometimes you forget about them for a whole day, and then you say something they used to say, or you smell something and that person comes rushing back into your memory. And you whimper to yourself that how so desperately you wanted to be their friend, or you cuss yourself out for having these feelings and all that you did wrong. You might wonder if that makes you a narcissist. You know, you're constantly obsessing over the things you should have said and done. Sometimes you spend so much time focusing on the bad things that you did, that those feelings begin to tint the life that you live in the present. It trains your brain, not unlike Pavlov's dog, to respond to pain and longing. It makes you feel sad in moments where you shouldn't be. You might be well acquainted with grief, but you never really move beyond the first 4 stages, because the act of acceptance means that you have to let these lamentations go. There's a small moment in Silent Hill 2. Most people skim it. When James is in the hospital and Maria is following him around, he comes across a note while looking for the purple bull key.
The potential for this illness exists in all people, and, under the right circumstances, any man or woman would be driven like him to the other side. The other side, perhaps, may not be the best way to phrase it. After all, there is no wall between here and there. It lies on the borders where reality and unreality intersect. It is a place both close and distant. Some say it isn't even an illness. I cannot agree with them.
The text is most likely about a patient who has some sort of delusions or psychosis, but I read it slightly differently. To me, this represents ruminations. Rumination is what happens to you late at night when you think about what if. It occurs as you fantasize about all the different ways in which you could have changed things, and you just think about how someone you think you care about, and they just crush your ego night after night. The other side, where ruminations exist, it is the port of misery, in which you can't move on from something, so you try your hardest to control these thoughts so that you might fall to sleep easier. If another person's consciousness lives inside of us, as Hofstadter described, then rumination is how we kill them once again. We distort and we destroy. I had to start taking sleep meds to stop these, and I had to write all my feelings down to properly cleanse myself of them every single day. And when you think about someone every single day, you maintain every single bite of their being in their memory, and every hair on their head and every thread in their coat, you forget them as a person. Over time, you photocopy, and you destroy them as an agent, a person who had dreams, and this robs them of their dignity. They become a simulacrum, a shadow, a simulation of someone you once knew, and you ruminate upon their form to maintain them as an object of scorn. These flashes remind you of the bad things that you did, and you replay their memories in your head to figure out a way in which to fix it all. But that will never happen, because they don't think about you the same way that you think about them. This entire reason that the rumination occurs is that they wanted you out of their life, and if they felt as you do, they would get in contact with you. You know, Bill is crushed once he finds out that Francis thought of him but didn't call. You know, such a Lamentations from the other side. You lose what the person you cared for would have actually wanted, because it's in direct conflict with the rumination itself. You know, you might pop up in their memories, and maybe they get annoyed if they acknowledge it at all. And then they go on with their life, because it's something they're better off doing without you. The whole point of rumination, I learned, is that it inflicts the pain onto someone else. In ruminating, you desire the object of your mind's eye, and you hope that they will reciprocate your feelings, because if they did, it would justify all the time you spent thinking about them. And what a fucked up thing to want, you say to yourself. To wish pain onto someone you once loved. To desire that they dig a you-sized hole in their heart. And that you hope that they fill it with bad memories of you. And then you think about how thinking that makes you a bad person. And then you think about how the fact that you had that thought means that you're good. And then in reaction to that, you think you're just inherently selfish. And then you look up and Nathan Fielder makes an funny joke and you just laugh hysterically. In subtle and indirect ways, finding Francis reminded me of the perils of consciousness, the hedgehog problem, the fear of accepting that you are valuable and you can actually be loved. But more than that, it showed me that memories can represent the people we cherish, but it can also imprison your soul. Ruminations from the other side tend to freeze your wants and your needs into a stasis. They exist in a time before the bad things happened. You desire for your consciousness to revert back to a worse time, and therefore you can't change much about yourself now. You are saving yourself for marriage, as it were. You know, Bill never married or had kids, and it's unclear as to whether or not this is entirely because he was waiting for Francis or he never found the right person and then he fixated on Francis as the perfect subject for his own selfish reasons. This terrible union makes you into an incomplete and worse person, and you shouldn't ever wish for someone to feel as wretched as you feel on the inside. It's a really vicious type of self-harm, and it's incredibly hard to stop. All of it alienates you from other people and from the nature of love and compassion. I do fight. I consider myself an optimistic nihilist, but I do fight against nihilism. Every day, you don't need to pass uni. You don't need to be kind. You'll be dead in the ground one day, and none of your niceness will ever matter. I admit that I've been losing more than winning lately. I worry that because I'm so depressed and I hate myself so much, that other people just can't enjoy my company, because how could there ever be a possibility of someone loving you if you can't love yourself? And then you remember that's exactly what she used to say. And it's why she pushed you and all of her friends away like clockwork. And then you shiver. You shiver all over in your body when you recognize that you've taken on her worst trait. It was this silent conviction I did not uphold. How the fuck did a Bill Gates impersonator make me feel all of this? None of this is explicitly mentioned in Finding Francis. It's all in the subtext, the inner psychology of a man who has more regrets than achievements. Someone so desperate to live the life of another man that he considers destroying what relationship and contact he can actually maintain. Rumination forces you into thinking in a binary. People are either good or they are bad. You've been hurt, and you must try to retroactively fix it, and you rob yourself of the emotional truth if you think like this, because human behavior is not binary. You must accept the good times with the bad. Because, you know, you might say something that they once said, and that means that their memory is still important to you. Forgive me for being sentimental, because both of these properties mean a lot to me. It scared me how much Silent Hill 2 read my mood and confronted me with how dishonest to myself I was being. And towards the end of my grieving process, a year and a half later, Finding Francis put onto me the ways I was still ruminating and continuing to harm myself. And this is the most frustrating part of all of this, because I know it's wrong and I know it's bad for me. Like, obviously this video is a monument to ruminations, and I believe everything that I've said. And I try to practice it, but it's like it's libidinal. I want to stop and I can't stop. These thoughts, they just pop up and I can't make them stop. And this is as fascinating as anything else, because I know that I'm wrong, but I continue to believe it all anyway. I have no solution for you. I can report that I've only been getting better at not going to the other side, at looking at violence, at ruminating. it all comes in waves. But I'm finally reaching acceptance. But it's still hard. Hofstadter found beauty in Ruminations, and I do not think that beauty was manufactured or sprayed with rose extract, all to justify how much time he spent thinking about his deceased wife. But my point is that we can ruin the beauty of this dialectic by allowing fantasy to take us over. And if that isn't the point of Silent Hill 2, the lesson that was supposed to be taught, then what else was? On her deathbed, James confessed his resentment, and Mary replies, "If that were true, why do you look so sad?" I return to Hofstadter whenever I feel angry at myself for these feelings, because if there's nothing else I learned in the previous year, we shouldn't be afraid of love or loving others, but at the same time, we must have a respect for ourselves and for our own judgment. I do not use all I have spoken about to excuse the bad things that I've done, and neither should it be used as ammunition for those who have been abusive to others to absolve themselves. I try my best to be a better person with every day that passes, to learn from my own mistakes. Silent Hill 2 is very comforting to me because it means that I'm not alone and I'm not the only person who feels these things. I imagine that's why it's so powerful to you as well. And I hope that my analysis, or whatever you could call this piece, sort of articulated those feelings for you as well. There are certain things that I cut from this piece, a longer discussion about Eddie and how his immaturity mirrors James. I really wanted to talk about the soundtrack, but I have nothing new or insightful to add there. I love it so much, and I use tracks in my videos quite often. I wanted to talk about the rehearsal, but I cut that completely lest this video become a 3-hour behemoth, and I wanted to talk about like PS2 games. I decided instead to focus on this cross-section that found between the wildly different pieces of art, and I want to express to you my final takeaway with all of this. You might think about someone every single day, but I assure you it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Silent Hill 2 showed me that, and finding Francis was an assurance that life can be alright. Thank you for watching.